Easter morning was supposed to be about family, but instead, it was the day everything shattered. The front door closed behind a woman who chose another man over her husband and 3 little boys. Left alone with broken promises and 3 innocent faces looking for answers, one father had to rebuild a life from nothing, and what happened next changed everything. Easter Sunday began the way peaceful days often do, quietly, almost gently, as if the world hadn't yet decided what kind of day it would become. Soft morning light slipped through the kitchen window, spreading across the counter where colored eggs sat in a small basket the boys had prepared the night before. The house still smelled faintly of vinegar and food coloring from their late-night egg decorating. It had been messy, chaotic, and full of laughter. The narrator woke earlier than usual, careful not to wake anyone. There was something comforting about these small routines, making breakfast before the boys came rushing down the stairs, hearing their excited voices fill the house. Coffee brewed slowly, filling the kitchen with warmth. Toast popped from the toaster. Pancake batter sizzled on the pan. Outside, the neighborhood was still quiet, the early spring air calm and cool. From upstairs came the faint sound of footsteps. One of the boys. Soon the other 2 would follow, running down the stairs in pajamas, arguing over who would get the biggest chocolate egg. Those small moments had always felt like the real meaning of family. But that morning, something felt different. The house was quieter than usual. Not peaceful quiet. A heavier kind. The narrator noticed it when his wife finally appeared at the kitchen doorway. Normally she would smile at the sight of the breakfast spread or tease him about making too many pancakes. This time, she didn't. She stood there silently, arms folded, her expression distant in a way that immediately unsettled him. For a moment he thought maybe something was wrong. Maybe she was tired. Maybe they'd argue about something small later and laugh it off the way couples often did. But the silence stretched longer than it should have. Her voice finally broke it. Calm. Almost cold. She said she wasn't staying. At first the words didn't make sense. They floated in the air like pieces of a sentence that had been spoken in the wrong order. Then she said it clearly. She was leaving. Not just for the day. Not just for space. She was leaving to be with someone else. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls had moved closer. The narrator stood there, still holding the spatula, trying to process what he had just heard. There were 100 questions rushing through his mind at once. How long had this been happening? Why today? Why Easter? But before any of those questions could form into words, the sound of footsteps thundered down the stairs. The boys. 3 small voices filled the hallway, full of excitement. Dad. Are the eggs hidden yet? In that moment, something inside the narrator shifted. The heartbreak could wait. The confusion could wait. But those 3 boys couldn't see their world collapse in front of them. His wife picked up her bag by the door. There was no shouting. No dramatic goodbye. Just the quiet sound of the front door opening. And then closing. The click of that door echoed through the house far louder than it should have. The narrator stood there in the kitchen, the smell of pancakes still hanging in the air, while 3 little boys ran toward him with smiles that didn't yet know their lives had just changed forever. The first few weeks after she left didn't feel real. Life kept moving, but everything felt slightly out of place, like the rhythm of the house had been thrown off and nobody knew how to fix it. The boys still woke up early. They still ran through the house with the same noisy energy. They still argued over cereal choices and whose turn it was to sit by the window in the car. But something had changed. Every now and then one of them would ask a simple question that made the narrator's chest tighten. Is Mom coming home today? Those moments were the hardest. There was no guidebook for explaining heartbreak to children who were still young enough to believe every problem had a simple solution. So the narrator did the only thing he knew how to do. He focused on being there. Mornings became a carefully timed routine. Packing lunches, tying shoelaces, making sure backpacks had everything they needed before rushing everyone out the door. The house often looked like a small tornado had passed through it, toys scattered across the floor, unfinished homework on the table, tiny socks somehow appearing in places socks should never be. By the time the boys were finally dropped off at school, the narrator often felt like he had already lived half a day. Work didn't stop just because life had fallen apart. Long hours at his job were followed by grocery shopping, cooking dinner, helping with homework, baths, bedtime stories, and the quiet cleanup that came afterward. The evenings were the loneliest. Once the boys were asleep, the house became painfully silent. The narrator would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea or coffee, staring at the empty chair across from him. That chair used to hold conversations about ordinary things, bills, school events, weekend plans. Now it just sat there, unused. Sometimes he wondered if the neighbors noticed. Single fathers weren't common in their neighborhood. At school events, he often saw pairs of parents standing together while he stood slightly apart, holding one child's hand while the other two ran ahead. There were moments when he felt people watching him with quiet curiosity. Some offered polite sympathy. Others simply avoided the topic altogether. But what mattered most were the boys. They had begun adapting in their own small ways. The oldest tried to act a little more responsible, helping his younger brothers clean up toys. The middle one asked questions more often, trying to understand what had happened. The youngest simply clung to the narrator more than before, holding his hand whenever they walked somewhere. Those small gestures kept the narrator going. He started learning things he had never thought much about before: braiding hair for school events, packing balanced lunches, remembering which child preferred bedtime stories about dinosaurs and which one liked superheroes. It wasn't perfect. There were burnt dinners, forgotten permission slips, and mornings where everyone ran late. But slowly, something important began to grow inside that chaotic routine. Strength. The narrator wasn't just surviving anymore. He was becoming the steady center of his son's world. And although he didn't realize it yet, someone nearby had quietly begun to notice the effort he was putting into holding that world together. It happened on an ordinary weekday afternoon, the kind of day that blended quietly into all the others. School pickup had become one of the narrator's most predictable routines. Every afternoon he stood near the same spot by the school gate, leaning slightly against the metal fence while scanning the crowd of parents and children pouring out of the building. The first few times he had come alone, it felt uncomfortable. Most of the other parents stood in small groups, chatting easily with each other while they waited. Mothers exchanged quick updates about school activities. Fathers occasionally joined in, but many simply stood nearby scrolling through their phones. The narrator usually kept to himself. Part of it was exhaustion. Part of it was the quiet feeling that he didn't quite belong in those circles anymore. That afternoon the sun was warm, the kind of soft spring warmth that made the air feel calm and easy. Children's voices filled the schoolyard, backpacks bouncing as they ran toward waiting parents. Soon the narrator spotted his boys. The youngest came first, racing toward him with the same burst of energy he always had. "Dad." The small figure practically launched into his arms. The narrator laughed softly, catching him just in time before the momentum knocked them both off balance. The older two followed close behind, talking over each other about something that had happened in class. For a moment, everything felt normal again. That was when he noticed her. She was standing a few steps away near the school entrance, watching the scene with a quiet smile. At first, the narrator assumed she was waiting for someone else. She looked around 42 or 43, confident in a calm, effortless way. Her posture was relaxed, her expression warm without being overly expressive. There was something about the way she observed people that suggested patience. She noticed the youngest boy clinging happily to the narrator's arm. Then she stepped a little closer. "Looks like someone had a good day," she said gently. Her voice was warm and steady. The narrator turned slightly, a bit surprised that she was speaking to him. Up close, he noticed small details, soft lines near her eyes that appeared when she smiled, the way she brushed a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear as she spoke. Before he could respond, the middle son answered proudly. Dad always picks us up. The woman nodded thoughtfully, glancing at the narrator again. That's a good thing, she said. There was no judgment in her tone, only quiet approval. The conversation might have ended there, but the youngest boy suddenly dropped his backpack while trying to dig out a crumpled drawing from inside. Paper spilled onto the ground. The narrator bent down quickly to gather them, but the woman had already crouched beside him to help. Their hands briefly reached for the same sheet of paper. For just a second, their fingers brushed. It was a small, accidental touch, the kind that normally meant nothing. But in that moment, the narrator felt strangely aware of it. She handed the paper to him with a soft smile. Future artist, she asked, glancing at the colorful drawing of dinosaurs and superheroes. Something like that, the narrator replied with a quiet laugh. The boys quickly began talking to her as if she had always been part of the conversation. Children had a natural way of deciding who felt safe. She listened patiently, asking small questions and reacting with genuine interest. Before leaving, she turned back toward the narrator. "You're doing a good job with them," she said simply. Then she gave his arm a brief, reassuring touch before walking away. The narrator stood there for a moment, watching her disappear into the small crowd of parents. It was only a few seconds. But somehow, it felt like the first moment in a long time that someone had truly seen him. After that afternoon at the school gate, the narrator began noticing her more often. At first, it was just small things. A familiar figure standing near the entrance during pickup. A brief wave across the schoolyard. A few friendly words exchanged while the children gathered their backpacks and hurried outside. Her name, he eventually learned, was Elena. She had a calm presence that seemed to slow the world down a little whenever she spoke. Around 42, she carried herself with quiet confidence, the kind that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it. The narrator noticed how easily she spoke with the children. Not just as boys, all of them. She knelt down when talking to them, meeting their eyes instead of speaking from above like many adults did. She listened carefully to their stories, no matter how small or exaggerated they sounded. The boys seemed to trust her almost immediately. One afternoon, the youngest ran straight toward her before even reaching his father. "Look what I made today." He held up a slightly crooked paper craft from school. Elena crouched down with genuine interest, studying the uneven folds as if it were something truly impressive. "That's pretty creative," she said with a warm smile. The narrator watched the interaction quietly. There was something comforting about the way she spoke to them, patient, gentle, and natural. Over time, their conversations began lasting a little longer. Sometimes they stood together near the school gate while the boys played nearby with their friends. Other times they walked slowly toward the parking lot while the children raced ahead. Most of their conversations were simple. Work, school schedules, funny stories about the boys, or small observations about everyday life. But even those ordinary talks carried a quiet ease. One afternoon, while sitting on a bench near the playground after pickup, Elena watched the boys climbing across the jungle gym. "They seem really happy," she said softly. The narrator followed her gaze. "They've been through a lot lately," he admitted. "But they're stronger than people think." Elena turned slightly toward him, studying his expression. "And so are you." Her words were simple, but the sincerity in her voice made them land differently. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The playground echoed with children's laughter while a gentle breeze moved through the trees. They were sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The narrator became aware of the small details, the faint scent of her perfume, the calm rhythm of her breathing, the way she tucked her hands into the sleeves of her light jacket when the breeze picked up. Then something small happened. One of the boys ran over and dropped a toy car beside the bench before rushing back toward the playground. As the narrator leaned down to pick it up, Elena reached for it at the same time. Their hands met again. This time, the touch lingered just a fraction longer. Neither of them pulled away immediately. Elena's fingers rested lightly against the back of his hand before she gently passed him the toy. Their eyes met for a brief second. There was no awkwardness, only a quiet awareness that something unspoken had passed between them. Still, the narrator felt a familiar hesitation rise inside him. He had spent months rebuilding stability for his sons. The last thing he wanted was to complicate their lives again. And yet, when Elena smiled at him, warm, patient, understanding, it felt strangely easy to forget those fears, even if only for a moment. By the time autumn arrived, Elena had quietly become a familiar part of the narrator's routine. Not in a dramatic way. There had been no sudden moment where everything changed, no grand declaration that shifted the course of their lives. Instead, it had happened the way many meaningful connections do, slowly, through small, repeated moments. Conversations at the school gate. Short walks to the parking lot. Occasional afternoons at the park when the boys wanted to stay and play longer. Over time, the narrator realized something surprising. The boys had started expecting Elena to be there. Whenever she appeared, the youngest would run toward her with excitement, eager to show whatever drawing or craft he had brought home that day. The middle son often asked her questions about books he was reading. Even the oldest, who had been more guarded since their mother left, had begun speaking to her more comfortably. Elena never forced those interactions. She simply listened. And somehow, that was enough. One evening after a school fundraiser, the crowd slowly began to thin out. Parents gathered their children and headed toward the parking lot while volunteers folded tables and packed away decorations. The air had grown cooler as the sun disappeared, leaving the sky painted in soft shades of orange and purple. The boys had run ahead toward the playground nearby, chasing each other while waiting for their father. That left the narrator and Elena standing quietly near the emptying school courtyard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was one of those comfortable silences that didn't need to be filled immediately. Then Elena exhaled softly and sat down on the wooden steps near the entrance. "Long day," she said with a small smile. The narrator sat beside her. Close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Feels like most days are long lately," he admitted. Elena studied him thoughtfully for a moment, her expression calm but observant. "You carry a lot," she said gently. The narrator shrugged slightly, though he knew she wasn't wrong. "They're my responsibility," he replied, glancing toward the playground where the boys were laughing in the distance. "And you've handled it better than most people would." Her words were sincere. The narrator looked down at his hands for a moment, unsure how to respond to praise he didn't feel he deserved. Then Elena surprised him. "I know what it's like," she said quietly. He looked up. She had never spoken much about her own life before. Her gaze drifted toward the fading light on the horizon. "I spent a long time in a marriage where I felt invisible," she continued. "Everything looked fine from the outside. But inside, there was nothing left." There was no bitterness in her voice. Just honesty. The narrator listened carefully. Sometimes people didn't need solutions, they simply needed someone willing to hear them. "I stayed longer than I should have," she added softly. "Out of habit, maybe. Or fear of starting over." A gentle breeze passed through the courtyard. Without thinking, the narrator spoke quietly. "Starting over isn't easy." Elena turned slightly toward him, her eyes soft. "No," she agreed. "But sometimes it's the only way to find something real again." The words lingered between them. After a moment, the narrator said something he hadn't admitted out loud before. "I still worry about my boys, about how all of this affects them." Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand gently over his. The touch was warm and steady. "You're giving them something more important than a perfect life," she said softly. "You're giving them stability. Love. Someone who shows up every day." Her hand remained there for a moment. Then the narrator turned his palm slightly, letting his fingers rest around hers. The connection was simple. But it felt meaningful. After a while, Elena stood. Before stepping away, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him in a warm, reassuring hug. It lasted only a few seconds. But when she stepped back, their faces remained close for just a moment longer than expected. Neither of them moved right away. Both of them understood the quiet truth that had been growing between them. Something real was beginning. And that realization made them both hesitate, not because they didn't want it, but because they knew it mattered. By winter, Elena was no longer just someone the narrator happened to see at school. She had become part of the rhythm of their lives. It started with small invitations. An extra chair at the table during a weekend lunch. A casual walk through the park when the boys wanted to feed the ducks. A quiet stop for hot chocolate after a long afternoon at a school event. Nothing about it felt forced. Elena never tried to step into a role that wasn't hers. She never rushed the boys or expected anything from them. She simply showed up. And somehow, that steady presence meant more than big gestures ever could. The narrator began noticing how naturally the boys gravitated toward her. The youngest liked holding her hand while walking across the park paths. The middle one often tried to impress her with stories about things he'd learned at school. Even the oldest, who had built emotional walls after their mother left, slowly started letting them down around her. One Saturday evening, the four of them went to the park just before sunset. Winter had softened into early spring, and the air carried that cool freshness that comes before warmer days return. The playground was quieter than usual, most families already heading home for dinner. The boys ran ahead toward the swings, their laughter echoing across the open space. That left the narrator and Elena walking slowly along the gravel path behind them. For a while, they simply watched the boys play. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the grass, painting everything in warm shades of gold and orange. "They really trust you," Elena said softly. The narrator glanced toward the boys, who were now competing to see who could swing the highest. "I think they just like anyone who listens to their stories," he replied with a quiet smile. Elena looked at him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "It's more than that," she said gently. "They feel safe with you." Those words landed heavily. The narrator had spent months worrying whether he was doing enough, whether he was somehow failing them without realizing it. Hearing someone say the opposite felt strangely overwhelming. "They deserve better than what happened," he admitted quietly. Elena stepped a little closer. "They have someone who stayed," she said. The breeze lifted a few strands of her hair, and she brushed them behind her ear again, a small gesture the narrator had come to recognize. As they resumed walking, something subtle happened. Their hands brushed. Just lightly at first. But this time, neither of them pulled away. Instead, Elena's fingers gently closed around his. The movement was soft, almost hesitant, as if she was giving him the chance to step back if he wanted. He didn't. The narrator let his hand remain in hers, feeling the warmth of her touch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt peaceful rather than awkward. Eventually, the narrator exhaled slowly. "There's something I should probably admit," he said. Elena glanced at him. "What's that?" He hesitated before answering. "I've been afraid to let myself care about someone again." It was the first time he had spoken that fear out loud. Elena didn't look surprised. Instead, she squeezed his hand gently. "That makes sense," she said softly. "Losing someone like that changes how you see everything." They stopped walking for a moment. The boys were still laughing in the distance, unaware of the quiet moment unfolding behind them. The narrator looked at Elena. "I don't want my past to ruin something good," he said honestly. Her expression softened. "It doesn't have to," she replied. Then she stepped a little closer. Close enough that the space between them almost disappeared. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do," she added quietly, "is choose to trust again." The narrator felt the truth of those words settle deep inside him. For the first time in a long while, the fear didn't feel stronger than the hope. And in that quiet evening light, still holding Elena's hand, he realized something important. They had both already stopped pretending that this was just friendship. What they were building together was something deeper. And neither of them wanted to walk away from it. Spring returned quietly, almost the same way that new beginnings often do, gently, without asking for attention. Months had passed since that evening at the park when the narrator and Elena finally stopped pretending their connection was only friendship. Nothing about their relationship had changed overnight. There were no dramatic shifts or sudden declarations. Instead, their bond continued to grow the same way it had from the beginning, through patience, consistency, and small, meaningful moments. By now, Elena's presence felt natural in their lives. The boys greeted her with excitement whenever she visited. The youngest still liked to hold her hand while walking anywhere. The middle one often brought her books he wanted to talk about. Even the oldest, who once kept his distance from everyone, had begun sharing quiet conversations with her when the others weren't around. The narrator noticed those things carefully. Trust from children wasn't something that appeared overnight. It had to be earned. And Elena had earned it simply by being steady. One warm afternoon, they all gathered at a small park not far from the house. It was the kind of place families often visited on weekends: wide open grass, a few wooden picnic tables, and a playground that had clearly been repaired more times than anyone could count. The boys ran ahead immediately, racing each other toward the swings. The narrator and Elena followed at a slower pace, carrying a small picnic basket between them. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows across the grass. The air smelled faintly of fresh leaves and spring flowers. For a moment, the narrator simply watched the boys. They were laughing loudly, arguing about who could swing higher while their sneakers scraped against the dirt beneath them. There had been a time when he wondered if their lives would ever feel normal again. Now, standing there, the answer seemed quietly clear. Elena sat down on the picnic blanket and leaned back slightly on her hands, watching the boys with a relaxed smile. "They've grown a lot," she said softly. "They had to," the narrator replied. Then he sat beside her. Close enough that their shoulders touched. For a few moments they simply watched the children play. No pressure. No complicated thoughts. Just a peaceful afternoon. Eventually Elena rested her head lightly against his shoulder. The gesture was gentle, almost instinctive. The narrator felt the warmth of her presence beside him and realized how different life felt compared to that painful Easter morning months ago. Back then, everything had seemed broken beyond repair. But life had a way of moving forward, sometimes leading you toward people you never expected to meet. He turned slightly toward Elena and reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. She looked up at him, her expression calm but curious. The narrator smiled softly before leaning closer and placing a gentle kiss on her cheek. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The quiet sincerity behind it said everything. Elena's eyes softened, and she squeezed his hand in return. Across the playground, the boys suddenly called out for them to come watch something they were trying. The narrator stood up, offering Elena his hand to help her up from the blanket. Together they walked toward the swings where 3 excited boys were waiting. In that moment, the narrator understood something important. The worst day of his life had once felt like the end of everything. But sometimes, what feels like an ending is simply life making room for something better to grow. And now, standing beside Elena while his sons laughed in the warm afternoon sunlight, he realized they weren't just surviving anymore. They were building a new kind of family. One that had been shaped by loss, but strengthened by love, patience, and the courage to begin again.